Have you ever said no to something and then immediately felt the need to explain yourself? Not just no, I can't, but no, I can't because I got this thing. And then there's this other thing. And I know I said I might be able to, but circumstances have changed. And I really hope you don't think I'm being difficult. And I promise it's not because I don't want to. At some point, you're no longer saying no. You're presenting a closing argument. And I'm laughing because I know this one personally. I used to explain myself constantly. If I made a decision, I felt like I needed to explain it. If I had a boundary, I needed to explain it. And if I was upset, I needed to explain why I was upset. If I couldn't do something, I needed the other person to understand that I had a very good reason. Because apparently, simply having a feeling wasn't enough. I needed supporting documentation. And the funny thing is, I didn't realize how exhausting that was until I started looking back at my own patterns. Because what I eventually realized was, I wasn't always communicating. Sometimes I was defending myself. And there is a big difference. I'm Cristina Perri, and this is Smile Sessions, the podcast where we discuss ways to live healthier, happier, and more fulfilling lives. And today, we're talking about something I know extremely well. Why do we explain ourselves so much? Let's start with something important. There is absolutely nothing wrong with explaining yourself. Communication is healthy. Context can be helpful. If someone asks you a question, answer it. If someone needs information, give it to them. That isn't the problem. The problem is when explaining yourself becomes something you feel compelled to do. When no doesn't feel complete. When your boundary doesn't feel legitimate until the other person agrees with it. When you feel responsible for making sure nobody feels disappointed, uncomfortable, confused, or upset by your decision. That's different. Communication sounds like, I can't make it tonight. Defending yourself sounds like, I can't make it tonight because I've had such a busy week and I have a lot to do tomorrow. And honestly, I'm exhausted. And I know I said I probably could, but do you hear the difference? The first person is communicating information. The second person is trying to make their decision acceptable. And that distinction changed a lot for me. This is something that I wrote about in my book because this is a pattern that I know intimately. I wasn't trying to explain things. I was constantly trying to make people understand why I felt the way that I felt, why I made a certain decision, why something hurt me, why I needed something different, why I couldn't do something, or why I wasn't uncomfortable or upset. I genuinely thought I was trying to communicate. But when I look back now, I realize something. I wasn't always communicating. Sometimes I was trying to convince people that my feelings were legitimate. And that is a very different thing. Somewhere along the way, I started believing that if someone didn't understand my feelings, maybe my feelings weren't valid. So I would explain more. If they still didn't understand, I would explain it differently. And if they disagreed, I'd question myself. And eventually, something clicked for me. I wasn't just explaining myself to other people. I was explaining myself to myself. And that's exhausting. There are a lot of reasons why people over-explain. Sometimes it's personality. Sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes it's people-pleasing. Sometimes we've learned that being agreeable keeps the peace. And sometimes, for some people, there's a deeper layer. Trauma. Now, I want to be careful with that word. Not everyone who over-explains has experienced trauma. And over-explaining isn't just automatically a trauma response, but it can be a learned response to environments where you've experienced criticism, invalidation, emotional unpredictability, conflict, or situations where you constantly had to defend yourself. Your nervous system can learn, if I explain myself well enough, maybe I can prevent the conflict. think about that. You're not necessarily trying to convince someone. Your nervous system may be trying to keep you safe. Imagine living in an environment where you simply couldn't just say you're tired. Maybe you had to prove that you were really tired. Or, I don't want to go. You couldn't simply not want to go. There had to be a reason, a legitimate reason, a reason the other person would accept. So eventually you learned my feelings need evidence. And that belief can follow you into adulthood. You become incredibly good at anticipating people's objections. You explain before anyone even asks. You soften your statements. You add disclaimers. You say, I don't know if this makes sense. Or, I hope this doesn't sound selfish. Or, I know this might sound stupid. Or, I'm probably overreacting. And my favorite, I'm sorry, but... And before you know it, you're apologizing for your boundary before you even express it. And here's the interesting part. You may not even realize you're doing it because to you, it just feels like being considerate. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like being nice. But sometimes what we're calling being considerate is actually trying to manage someone else's reaction. Here's something I wish I understood much earlier. Your feelings don't require a unanimous vote. You don't require everyone to agree with your boundary. You don't need everyone to understand your decision before you allow it. And you definitely don't need to provide a 12-slide PowerPoint presentation explaining why you're uncomfortable. You can simply say, I don't want to. I can't. That doesn't work for me. I changed my mind. I need some time, and no. And yes, no is a complete sentence. Although, if you're an over-explainer, that sentence may initially feel wildly aggressive. You're going to say no, and then your brain's going to scream, wait, we didn't give them the backstory. But you don't have to. And this is where I want to connect this episode to the conversation we've already had in episode 3. We talked about gaslighting. One of the devastating effects of being repeatedly invalidated is that you can begin questioning your own perception. One of the devastating effects of being repeatedly invalidated is that you can begin questioning your own perception. Did that really happen? Am I overreacting? Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Then, in episode 4, we talked about stopping apologizing for taking up space. And now we're here because sometimes we don't just apologize for taking up space. We explain why we're allowed to occupy it, why we need rest, why we need alone time, why we don't want to attend something, why something hurt us, why we're uncomfortable, and why we're changing our minds. Eventually, we can become so focused on making our choices understandable to everyone else that we stop asking ourselves, what do I actually want? That's the danger. Because the more energy you spend on the other person's reaction, the less energy you have to listen to yourself. One of the biggest shifts for me was learning to ask, am I explaining this because this person genuinely needs information or I'm afraid of their reaction? That question is powerful because sometimes the answer is they need information. Perfect. Communicate. But if the answer is I'm afraid they're going to be disappointed in me, or I'm afraid they're going to think I'm selfish, I'm afraid they're going to be angry or misunderstand me, and that's when I can pause. Because maybe the work isn't finding a better explanation. Maybe the work is learning that I can survive if someone misunderstands me. I can understand if someone's disappointed in me. I can survive someone disagreeing with me. I can survive someone not liking my boundary. And most importantly, I don't have to abandon myself to make someone else comfortable. So here's something I want you to try. The next time you're about to send that 5-paragraph text explaining why you can't do something, stop. Take a breath. And ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, what am I actually trying to communicate? Strip it down. What is the actual message? Number 2, what am I afraid will happen if I don't explain everything? This is the important one. Are you afraid they'll be angry, disappointed, judgmental? Will they think you're selfish? And number 3, what would I say if I knew I didn't have to convince them? That question can change everything, because sometimes the answer becomes incredibly simple. I can't. I don't want to. That doesn't work for me. I need something different. And that's it. Here's something else I want you to consider. Being misunderstood is uncomfortable, but being misunderstood is not necessarily dangerous. And those things are not the same thing. If you've spent years trying to make people understand you differently, this might be a difficult lesson, because you're going to understand that some people are going to misunderstand you. Some people will disagree with you, and many won't like your boundaries, and some may find you the villain in their own story. And guess what? You don't have to audition for the role of the good person in everyone's story. You just have to know who you are. So maybe we create a new rule. Before you explain yourself, pause. Is this communication, or am I asking for permission? Because you can communicate without permission. You can explain without defending your existence. You can be kind without abandoning yourself. And you can have a boundary without writing a dissertation. And if you're someone who's spent years over explaining yourself, I want you to know something. You don't have to stop overnight. You're not failing if you catch yourself doing it. Just notice it. Notice when you start adding unnecessary explanations, when you feel that urge to convince, or when no suddenly feels dangerous. And instead of judging yourself, get curious. Because maybe that part of you isn't trying to be difficult. Maybe it's trying to protect you. And you can thank it. And then gently remind it, we're okay now. I don't need to convince everyone. Looking back at my own story, I think one of the biggest lessons has been this. I don't need to become better at explaining myself. I need to become more comfortable with trusting myself, because there's a difference between wanting to be understood and believing that you must be understood. A difference between giving context and needing their approval. A difference between communicating and defending yourself. And maybe healing is learning to recognize that difference. So, if you take one thing from today's episode, let it be this. You don't need to build a case for your own feelings. Your boundary doesn't become valid because someone understands it. Your no doesn't become legitimate because someone approves it. And your existence doesn't become real because someone else agrees with it. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can say is simply, this is what I need. And then stop talking. Because maybe healing isn't becoming better at explaining yourself. Maybe healing is becoming comfortable enough with yourself that you no longer have to. And I say, as someone who used to explain herself constantly, someone who thought being understood was being the same as being validated, someone who spent a lot of time make her feelings make sense to everyone else. And maybe that's why I wrote about it, because sometimes you don't realize how much you've been abandoning yourself until you finally stop and listen to your own voice. You don't need a permission slip to have feelings. You don't need a legal brief to have a boundary. And you don't need everyone to understand you. If this episode hit a little too close to home and you want to go deeper into the stories, patterns, and lessons that shape my own journey, grab a copy of my book, Stop Disappearing: How to Choose Yourself Without Guilt or Fear. I share the real-life experiences behind so many of the things we've talked about here, because sometimes understanding why we became who we are is this first step to becoming someone new. And if you're enjoying Smile Sessions, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Every week, we're going a little deeper into the things on how we feel, how we heal, and how we show up in our own lives. Because this isn't just about listening to someone else's story. It's about recognizing a little bit of your own. I'm Cristina Perri, and this has been another session for your soul.